Welcome back to Mount Olympus, everyone. This is the place where, as you know, Coel and I live alongside the Greek gods, from whence we dispense Olympian judgments about history, religion, and culture, while scornfully ignoring the fog that impedes our otherwise infallible vision. My name is Mike Pierce.
And my name is Coel Campo, and this is the final episode in our short series about modern politics and how left and right, liberal and conservative, keep changing their meanings.
Yes.
And to symbolize that, we start with a picture of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, as utterly different as can be imagined, I think.
Yes, not just in temperament, but in content. Yes.
We'll talk more about Trump later, but if you've been following along, you know that what we're talking about today is what happened after World War II. So, my question for you, Mike, is was there really a post war consensus?
Well, not absolutely, but certainly relative to what came later. The differences were sharper in Britain than in America because 1945 saw Britain's first outright majority for a Labour government in an election and the introduction of the welfare state. But it's hard not to notice that when a few years later the Tories regained government, they didn't undo what Labour had done. So there's a kind of element even there of consensus. But in both countries, the more conservative party came to accept the changed furniture inaugurated by the left. So the Republican administrations in the 1950s under Eisenhower didn't wholesale undo what Roosevelt had done. So to that extent, you can say there's a consensus. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that brings us to consider, in respect of both countries, this man, John Maynard Keynes, and also the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. Keynes was an extremely influential British economist, influencing Democrats in America, Labour in Britain, but also to an extent, as we've just said, the Republicans and the Conservatives as well. And really, the height of his career was during the terrible years at the end of the 1920s and early 1930s, when there wasn't so much a recession as a depression, catastrophic unemployment. And his theories were an attempt to save capitalism. I realize that in the eyes of many hardline free marketeers, his name is anathema, but what he thought he was doing was trying to save capitalism from its fragility and the extremes of boom and bust by generating more demand when there simply wasn't enough, by simply creating money through government. Now, normally that would be a foolish thing to do, but inflation is not really a worry when millions and millions of people are out of work and there's insufficient demand. So his idea was that government could create demand by creating public works projects of various kinds. And also that would have what is still called in economics today the multiplier effect. That is, that if somebody who was previously unemployed is now getting paid by government to do a job that is of some value, they go and spend their wages. And so that too is injected into the economy and starts to circulate around. It doesn't do so forever. I think the right number is 1.8 or 1.6. Someone will doubtless correct me in the comments. But that was the idea. And Roosevelt took on board basically Keynes's theories and applied them in the American context. What he thought he was doing, the priority for him wasn't simply economic, but it was political. He could see countries in Europe going down one by one to authoritarian, mostly hard right, even fascistic regimes. And he wanted to be sure that the American people didn't have to choose between basic economic security and freedom.
And even if that's not necessarily how it worked out, when we're looking at history, we need to pay attention to what people thought they were doing, maybe rather than what actually happened.
Yeah, although you'd have to say that, at least in the American case, it did have something like the effect that he wanted. The Marshall Plan after the war could be considered a kind of international version of Keynesian economics. American aid coming in wholesale to build up the shattered European economies after World War II. And many of our viewers will know this, but by the end of World War II, the United States accounted for 50% of global GDP. I mean, that is
Wow.
absolutely eye-popping, right? It's
Yeah.
a situation that had never been attained by anybody before and never would be again. And so it was in a position to do that, to save them from going communist, actually. That was the main fear then, not so much fascism as communism. And although one shouldn't overstate the extent of the Marshall Plan in the economies of Britain, France, West Germany, and so on, it was nevertheless significant. But of course, Keynesianism does have its limits because the critiques made from free marketeers are valid under most circumstances. I'd want to argue, just to annoy both free marketeers and Keynesians alike, that Keynesianism does indeed work, but only if the emergency is extreme enough. The practical problem is that human beings are feeble-minded. Let's take an extreme example of a famine in some region of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And there are people starving to death. Everybody will say, even hard-boiled free marketeers, free market principles be blowed. These people are dying. We need to ship in, food right now, like Deus ex machina, right? But you don't want to keep doing that forever, or you will indeed inhibit local agriculture and the local economy because all this stuff is coming in for free. So at what point do you cut it off? And that's a very difficult question. So Keynesianism does work if the emergency is extreme enough, but it needs to be cut off at a certain point. Otherwise, you get hooked on it. And then it simply makes the economy sclerotic, as the British spent 30
Right.
years proving after World War II.
Right. This makes me think of the phrase, how's it go? Give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Right.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
teach
yeah.
a man to fish and he feeds himself forever or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, looking then at the post-war period, we'd be remiss in not mentioning this man. And even though I'm no Keynesian, and he was, I really like reading him because he reads like a dream and he is so funny. Yes, he lived to be 100, as you can see. So he's a Keynesian economist born in Canada. He made his career in the US as an academic, a diplomat. If I remember correctly, I think he was ambassador to China for a while, and a government advisor. But basically, he argued for Keynesian type policies in America as well after the war. Before the war, he was a bit too junior for that. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think he says he was working in one of Roosevelt's new government organizations in a fairly junior capacity. And he suddenly heard that John Maynard Keynes was about to visit his office. And he said, I felt as though a lowly parish priest was just about to be visited by the Archangel Gabriel. This is the way that he talked. When I was in my last few days teaching in Houghton, I was asked to speak at the baccalaureate. I was a bit taken by surprise because I got the strong impression over many years that the administration there didn't think much of me and they'd taken every opportunity in public occasions to keep me well hidden. But since I was about to leave, they decided they'd let me do this. So I opened with a Galbraith quote. Commencement oratory must eschew anything that smacks of partisan politics, political preference, sex, religion, or any unduly firm opinion. Nonetheless, there must be a speech. Speeches in our culture are the vacuum that fills the vacuum. So
Yeah.
just felt like confirming the administration's opinion of me as I was taking my final bow.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure they would agree with you.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that you like to say that in the early 20th century, a social democrat was essentially a Marxist who didn't actually want to kill you. I'm sure our viewers have heard that one before. So how is it that these guys later on it got so squidgy later in the century?
Well, we've got a list here of points, the process by which that happens. Really, the key domino fell very early in the early 20th century. Before that, actually, in the case of France, if we consider a figure like Georges Clemenceau, who was the French leader at the Paris peace treaties after World War One, he was actually a member of I think it was called the Revolutionary Socialist Party. And you think, my gosh, and he was in government, right? He was leading the government. And there were a number of other political parties in France with similarly ferocious sounding names at the same time. And yet France was a perfectly normal country. It wasn't becoming communist or anything like that because they had already become kind of squidgy. The process happened a little later elsewhere. But that first domino is the long-term, not short-term, the long-term consequence of the decision to play electoral politics rather than revolution. And once you've made that decision, then I would say that the hardline socialists and Marxists have essentially sold the pass because anything they want to do has got to get the say-so of the public through the ballot box. Right. And so you're going to go for social amelioration. Nobody in their senses of any political persuasion would think that you're going to upend a whole country during one 4-year or 5-year electoral term, whatever it is in the country concerned. So you're going to move in that direction, hope to get re-elected, and then move further in that direction, right? But this is a betrayal of Lenin's the worse the better. What Lenin wanted was for conditions, in this case in Russia, to be as awful as possible so that more and more people would support a revolution. And here are these so-called socialists actually working to make things better and more bearable. How dare they? And this tended to win them hatred from the Soviet Union, contempt from leaders in communist countries. I mean, much later, when Khrushchev visited Britain after the war, and he witnessed, I think it was a trade union congress or a Labour Party conference, something like that, and said that if he were British, he would support the Conservatives. Well, that's pretty rich coming from a commie. So why? Because he actually held that kind of agitation in contempt. What you want is a revolution and make a clean sweep. And so what socialist parties did, and clearly it differed from one country to another, and it wasn't in any case a straight line, once they got elected, was to go for amelioration. Now, the problem with this is, practically, sorry, we're about to anger a load of people here, is that socialism doesn't work. So you introduce some kind of statist improvement. Let's say that the housing situation is deplorable and rents are obnoxiously high relative to people's ability to pay. And so government steps in and says, we're going to introduce a rent cap. To be sure, higher on a bigger apartment than a smaller one, or a bigger house than a smaller one, and so on, calibrated according to the premises. But that's what we're going to do. Now, basically, anybody knows what's likely to be the result of that. Firstly, you're creating a new bureaucracy of government being paid for by the taxpayer to enforce all of this. Secondly, there's going to be loads and loads of rental accommodation withdrawn from the market. The price, however horrible it was before, was at that level because that was the relationship between supply of housing for rent and demand for it. And now that the price has gone down artificially, loads of suppliers or potential suppliers will withdraw from the market and find other uses for their property. And therefore, you're going to have increased homelessness. Third thing you're going to have is a black market, under the table deals that are illegal. Now, in almost all countries, there will be black markets, but in well-organized societies, they will be black markets in things that are clearly public bads, like drugs or pornography or prostitution or heavy weaponry, something like that, right? But the more socialist the country is, the more ordinary things end up having a black market. In communist countries, you have black markets in grocery items, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are an elected socialist government. We've introduced this reform, and then these bad consequences that we didn't think about happen. Are we going to wade deeper in and try and regulate this further, increase the size of the police force to catch people who are ducking and weaving? Or spend lots of extra public money on building housing to make good the shortfall or to house the homeless? And that in turn will have further consequences. And at some point, someone in the cabinet is going to cough very hard and say, election, election, right? And remind said government that they're going to need to win the next election to keep pursuing this kind of stuff at all. And so, how far are you going to go down this road? Now, the point that I'm making is that all of these left of centre parties, in theory and sometimes in name, committed to socialism, have been an incessant battleground. Indeed, they are today between pragmatics, the pragmatists who want to say, well, let's just make sure we do at least get back into office, and the people who stick to principles. And sometimes the latter win, and when they do, they're nearly always punished at the ballot box. And so the pendulum swings back to the pragmatists. And that's still going on. It's not a straight line, but in the long run, the move is towards the squidginess that you mentioned. Right. So by the time we get to the late 20th century, these parties are well-meaning, slightly fuzzy sort of people who have all sorts of good and warm instincts about how the state ought to look after people. And I'm not saying all of those things are bad. Obviously, many of them are very good. But that's why we've moved from the situation where, as I like to say, in the early 20th century, a social democrat was a Marxist who didn't actually want to kill you, through to warm, fuzzy, and mostly ineffectual by the late 20th century. That's how that movement happened.
Right. It sounds like, moral of the story, ideals are a good thing to have and necessary, but when it comes to politics, that doesn't always play out so well.
Well, you can't run a society on the basis of idealism. Although
Right.
the thought that you can is almost a Western obsession in modern times on left, right, and centre.
Yeah.
And as we're about to see, one of the essential conservative insights is not that you throw all principle to the wind, very far from it, but that you work with the grain of human nature. And in terms of, well, Harold Macmillan, the art of the possible.
Right. Right. Right.
Well, time now to consider American conservatism.
Now, until the 1950s, actual principled conservatism wasn't really a thing in America. So, was that to do with the fact that the US being such a young country?
Yes, there was conservatism of a sort. Think, for example, of the opposition to Roosevelt's policies, right? But it mostly didn't call itself that. Conservatism in the American mind was about Tories, who, of course, are very bad people, as we know from the time of the American Revolution, right? And empire and everything about wicked old Europe that America wasn't, or supposedly wasn't. Right? But by the time you get to the 1950s, America is old enough that it's got a number of traditions and a heritage of its own which at least some people are going to want to say, in the constantly changing world, we need to be hanging on to some of these things. And so that's when you start to see the birth of what we can consider to be a proper American conservative movement. Well, we should start off, I guess, by considering this guy, Russell Kirk, shown here with his family. Partway through his career, by the way, in 1963, he was converted to Catholicism from being a rather secular sort of person. And he and his wife and family spent the rest of their lives giving hospitality to political refugees and even to out and out hobos and getting involved in all kinds of charitable works. In fact, the local mockers used to call their house Piety Hill. So he was not simply a theorist, but very active. His doctoral thesis, The Conservative Mind, was published in 1953, and that remains today a fundamental text of American conservatism. Well, just to sum up some of his central canons. Firstly, it entails a belief in a transcendent order based in tradition, divine revelation, or natural law.
So, what it sounds like is that conservatism might be religious, but it also might not.
Yes, it rests on the kind of ambiguity on the point. That's down to individuals. And certainly religious minded people will say, well, the transcendent order exists because God put it there. And we know at least something about that through divine revelation. The more secular minded person might be perhaps a little more non-specific, or would say, well, this exists for reasons we can't really explain. But that deliberate ambiguity is still with us. The central point is that we collectively stand under something that is bigger than we are. We can't just make things up or proceed on the basis of commonplace rationalism. And that connects with the second point, an affection for the variety and mystery of human existence. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, which is why some identitarian politics that we find today that calls itself conservatism is anything but.
Right.
There isn't a one-size-fits-all. And a conviction that society requires orders and classes that emphasize natural distinctions.
Okay, this sounds a little bit like shaky ground.
Yeah, it does. I'm not at all sure about this. I suppose it's acceptable if and only if we mean by natural distinctions our natural abilities, intelligence abilities, and so on, which shouldn't be cramped by an exaggerated egalitarianism. A belief that property and freedom are closely linked, which certainly has to be true. As G.K. Chesterton pointed out, the person who owns his own house or has some kind of economic independence can afford to snap his fingers at government. Whereas if you don't have any of those things, then your life is going to be dominated by politics and the decisions of government, and you're likely to be very compliant. And a faith in custom, convention, and prescription. So here we're back to Burke versus Paine, as we discussed in the first episode of this series. And finally, a recognition that innovation must be tied to existing traditions and customs. Conservatives aren't opposed to innovation. Obviously, the world is changing. But one shouldn't simply be running at it pell-mell. So, tied to existing traditions and customs, which entails a respect for the political value of prudence.
So, what we're saying is we're ruling out making laws simply on the basis of strident principles. So, we need to be tentative, realizing that the future might work out differently than to what we were thinking or hoping.
Right. So, that sets the face of conservatism against some dogmatic insistence that we know where history is going. Right. Now, that's in its worst face. One sees that in the case of something like Marxism. They're sure that they know the stages of history and where we are.
Yeah.
But in a milder form, it's still there. I find the term progressive very obnoxious, actually, partly because the progress myth only comes out of the 18th century, and partly because it insists that the concerns of a particular political party or grouping tendency constitute progress. Who the heck is
Right.
to say?
Yeah.
But we still see this kind of nonsense with people talking about late stage capitalism. That's a hangover from Marxism. So Marxists were absolutely certain that capitalism was on its last legs. Well, I mean, perhaps it is, but not simply because your principles tell you that it is.
Right.
So we're pushing back against all of that. The future is not completely unknowable, but mostly unknowable. And so that means that our measures, whatever measures we take in any direction, need to be prudent and not simply strident. Yeah.
I have to admit, this really restores my faith in conservatism a little bit because right now it is not always looking so appealing in current U.S.
Well,
politics.
I'm going to argue that what we've got right now isn't conservatism at all. And
Right.
that's precisely everything that's wrong with it. But one thing at a time, we'll get there. This is, whether you agree with all of it or disagree with it or accept most of it or want to filter out a few things, it is at least conservatism. You know, Burke could have read
Yeah.
that and would have recognized it very well.
Right. Right.
And we need to mention this fellow as well.
Oh yes, this guy. You were raving about this book when you came across it while you were here in the summer. So you better tell us, why does Buckley matter so much?
Well, yes, this is a new biography, and I was amazed and delighted to come across it in a bookstore. And it's, yeah, just published this year. He is, after Russell Kirk, the most important American conservative thinker of modern times. I don't think there's anybody come along since who would be equivalent to them. I mean, the British Roger Scruton, who died just a couple of years ago, for sure. But in America, no. I find him less lovable a character than Russell Kirk. But well, everybody is welcome to go on YouTube and just key him in there and see some of his discussions and interviews and see what you think. But he was certainly very smart. His 1951 book, so he's only 26, God and Man at Yale, established him as one of the principal leaders of the nascent conservative movement. And a few years later, still only 30 years old, he founded the influential journal National Review, which is still with us and remains very important to this day. So, yeah, those are the two key thinkers, I think.
So, to move on to the other side of the aisle, in this episode, we're suggesting that the left has reinvented itself once since 1945, and the right actually twice.
Yes, the left's self reinvention has been an ongoing project. We are now at a point which you can trace right back to the 1970s. It's just been going further and further down a particular line. Whereas in the case of the right, yeah, they've reinvented themselves twice now. Well, by way of a prelude to an America specific situation, before we get properly into this, we can't not mention this big break. This is Lyndon Johnson, the US president from 63 to 69. And he is the one who finally brings about the end of segregation in America, famously in signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He quipped to an aide that his party was, quote, signing away the South for 50 years. And you'd have to say he was right. Up until that point, the South had been solidly Democrat because the Democrats were the party of segregationism, whereas the Act outlawed segregation and discrimination on grounds of race, sex, colour, religion, and national origin in voter registration, accommodation, and employment.
Now, this seems huge, and it was, but it was also long overdue. I mean, it's hard to take in how the Democratic Party included such wildly different elements, from northern labor unions to southern white segregationists, for so long.
Yeah, those would seem to be incompatible from where we're standing today. I mean, just a preliminary point, all big political parties tend to be coalitions of different factions and groups whose final metaphysics may bear little relation to one another, right? That continues to be true of pretty much all big political parties. But I would suggest that there is a common element between these apparent opposite extremes that we just mentioned, and that is the late 19th century style populism of the Democrats. They stood for the little man against big business and that kind of thing. And so that would take in things like labor unions. But standing for the little man in the South meant standing for the poor whites, right? I mean,
Right.
William Jennings Bryan, I don't think he actually spoke out for out and out racism, though someone can correct me in the comments. But he certainly ignored segregationism. And he spoke for the country people against the big city, that kind of thing. So there is that kind of common element there. But as the 20th century went on, those two things seem to be just fundamentally out of sync with one another. And so finally, something's got to give. And as has been remarked many times, a political cause is never finally lost until its natural defenders abandon it. Right?
Right.
So think back to the Corn Laws. It wasn't until Peel persuaded the Conservatives, or the Tories, to finally drop it that was the end of it.
Right.
Okay, so having got that kind of crucial bit of business out of the way, because it helps to explain quite a bit of what happens next, we need to mention something else going on in the 1960s, and that's what was called the counterculture. And this was expressed above all in the entertainment industry, especially pop music, but also movies, and the vast expansion in drug use, especially LSD. It enshrined a radical liberalization in social attitudes, especially to all things sexual. It was anti-authoritarian. It was radically individualistic. And it was predicated on high and increasing levels of prosperity, because you can't afford to be that individualistic unless everybody's pretty well off and is cushioned against the personal disasters that will naturally be created by certain kinds of behavior. Many of the movement's followers quietly abandoned it once college and youthful days were over and the need for getting on with a proper career took over. I'm thinking here of that song, The Free Electric Band. It's a manifesto of an utterly selfish young male, and he was worried that his girlfriend would settle for suburbia and a little patch of land. So I gave her up for music and the Free Electric Band. Right. That sickening mentality was actually considered cool at the time. Now, although a conservative backlash was noticeable from the mid 1970s, in America at least, its concerns never went away. And as the 1960s generation went on in their careers to become managers, journalists, politicians, and so on, so mainstream politics came to reflect its hyper-individualism.
So, all of this that you've just mentioned, this is really going to redefine the left. Now, I know you have a poisonous take on this too.
Yeah, oh, don't worry, the right are going to get theirs in a few minutes.
Well, of course, strictly in the interests of balance, of course.
Exactly. Well, if you really want to know.
Yeah, do we? Do we really want to know?
No idea, but you're getting it anyway. Okay,
Okay.
here's my take. By the 1960s, in countries like Britain and America, there was a growing problem for those on the political left, and that is that the countries were becoming too darn prosperous, that getting a winning electoral coalition from people who had economic grievances or who were poor or wanted to participate in class conflict was getting harder and harder and harder. I mean, one signal of this is the invention of the expression by, it might have been Harold Wilson, but somebody in the British Labour Party in the early 1960s, relative poverty, which is, if you think about it, a stroke of genius. Because even if you can get rid of, not all, but the vast majority of poverty, relative poverty will be with us forever. They'd invented political eternal life. But it was getting harder. And so by taking on board the interests and concerns of the 1960s counterculture, you could bolster the shrinking number of people who were seriously poor to form still a winning coalition for the future. And that's a trajectory that we've been on ever since. Well, even though this series has been mostly about Britain and America, let's look at one of the most drastic political explosions coming out of the 1960s counterculture. And that is the événement in Paris in May 1968, the definitive student uprising that absolutely epitomized 1960s style radicalism and the rise of this new left. Here's a load of them taunting the police from their barricades. And yeah, a barricade made out of cobblestones that could then be hurled at the police. And here is some hurling going on. And again. Now, actually, I mentioned Roger Scruton a few minutes ago. This basically was his political birth, if you like. He insisted that he had taken little interest in politics until Paris 1968, and he just happened to be there and witness all of this stuff. And he said he was so appalled by what he saw, these perfectly comfortably off young people in a perfectly comfortable country, having a brilliant education paid for through the taxpayers, nevertheless are able to contrive some kind of rhetoric that makes them into victims of some terrible oppression. And he says that having seen this, he decided there and then that whatever these people wanted or believed, I believed the opposite. And that was the beginning of his conservative career, if you like. Yeah.
Well, one good thing to come out of this tension then.
Yes, I suppose so. Well, what was this new coalition? Well, it described itself at the time quite often as a rainbow coalition. So including ethnic minorities and immigrants, feminists, gay and lesbian activists, environmentalists, pacifists and nuclear disarmers, and animal rights activists. There's probably some I've been forgetting there, but that about covers it.
So this is completely different to the economics and class-based grievances of socialism. So was this completely unprecedented?
Pretty much, yes. But a little bell is tinkling at the back of my brain here, reminding me that there was the faintest of tendencies in this direction in the background. George Orwell's novel The Road to Wigan Pier was written in 1937, and it includes these classic lines. One sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist and feminist in England. I think I object to this. I drink fruit juice. So
yeah,
it had been there. But it's really the 1970s that makes it prominent as sucking in the concerns of the 1960s counterculture.
Okay. So there is still one common element then. Both the old and the new wanted remedies via state intervention.
Yes, that is a common element, an expanding state to do things. Well, this new atmosphere was particularly marked at one very important event. And anybody above a certain kind of age, about 900 since you ask, will definitely remember it, even if they're not Americans. And that was the 1972 Democratic National Convention, which was an absolute train wreck. Has been described as a disastrous start to the general election campaign. It was the most unruly, infighting, chaotic convention of a major American party in modern times, in which new style radicals of all kinds dominated the traditional leadership by elected officials and labor unions. So they kind of just totally disrupted it. Its platform included a pledge to, quote, make the government the employer of last resort. The idea being that you would do away with unemployment, so a guaranteed job for everyone. Well, you can just imagine how loads of ordinary people will have thought about that, including loads of people who, until that moment, were strongly inclined to vote Democrat.
Right.
They eventually nominated presidential candidate George McGovern, who noted, I opened the doors of the Democratic Party and 20 million people walked out. So opening the doors
Yeah.
for these people to come in. But a third of all registered Democrats went on to vote for Nixon.
Wow.
But nevertheless, the convention does, for good or for ill, mark the decisive entrance of this new kind of rainbow coalition set of concerns into modern politics.
Right. And effectively, the Democrats had wallpapered themselves into this new coalition for the long term.
Yeah, they couldn't get out of it. But things did settle down a bit, at least being less unruly. But the same trend was going on in left of centre parties right through the West, right, for the same kinds of reasons.
Mm.
Okay, well, we're painting on the grand canvas here, and lots of people will object that we're caricaturing, but caricaturing is basically all we've got time to do. So the collapse of the old left since the 1970s has been completed by rising prosperity, the digital revolution, which has simply got rid of loads and loads of industrial jobs, and offshoring of remaining industrial production to, well, classically China, but Vietnam, Indonesia, other places as well. And that's thinned the traditional working class down to an electorally insignificant fraction of its former size.
So the industrial working class had, for the left, really gone the way of the old aristocrats and big landowners 100 years earlier on the right.
Yes, just as, let's say in Britain, the Tory party no longer really needed to pay attention to those people because they were such a small slice of the electorate, and you could take their votes for granted anyway. The Tory party had to concentrate on other constituencies. So this was now happening on the left. But in any case, the collapse of the Soviet Union and other communist states in 1989 to 91 confirmed to centre left leaders like Clinton and Blair the wisdom of distancing themselves decisively from socialist type projects and sticking to the rainbow coalition of cultural relativists. Okay, well, now we come to reinvention number one on the right: monetarism, neoconservatism, and the new right.
So this is where you dish it out on the other side.
Yeah, although we'll say something nice about them first.
Oh, great. And then crucify them.
You've got it. Yeah. Okay, well, let's mention this man here, Milton Friedman, He was professor of economics at the University of Chicago and Nobel Prize winner in 1976. And he made a strong case for free markets and a small state that was compelling to many people. I mean, he was inspired by, influenced by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, both Austrians who had made their careers in America. Well, Hayek, actually, a lot of it in Britain as well. But yeah, so he was following their kind of line.
Yeah, and this was because Keynesian or Keynesian type policies had made the economy just absolutely sluggish.
Yes, especially in Britain, right, where both parties had taken Keynesianism as essentially axiomatic, and all that did was simply to slow down the economy, increase the burden on the taxpayer, and so on. I refer back to the point I made earlier. The Keynesian, it's not that it doesn't work, but it only works in the kind of the social equivalent of a famine, right? It's got to be catastrophic, and then you bring in the aid, and then at a point much earlier than most feeble-minded human beings want, you then need to retreat to normality. But if you treat it simply as part of your ongoing diet, then it's poison. As Britain was proving, it was laughed at as the sick man of Europe by the 1970s. Yeah. Well, let's have a look here at one of his popular, very non-academic books that he co-wrote with his wife Rose, Free to Choose. I've just taken a passage that's kind of representative of the sort of argument that he makes. The key insight, Friedman says, of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is misleadingly simple. If an exchange between two parties is voluntary, it will not take place unless both believe they will benefit from it. Think about this. You wander into the corner mom and pop store with $1.80 in your pocket to buy a Mars bar. You want the Mars bar more than you want the $1.80 in your pocket, and the store owner wants the $1.80 more than he or she wants the Mars bar, right? And neither of you is mistaken, which is why the transaction happens. Right? He says it's a fallacy to assume that there is a fixed pie, a fixed size of economic pie, that one party can gain only at the expense of another. I mean, there are such circumstances in which one party can gain only at the expense of another, but they're where there's very, very heavy degrees of constraint. Slavery, for example. Right? The price system, he says, is the mechanism that performs this task without central direction, without requiring people to speak to one another or to like one another. It enables people to cooperate peacefully in one phase of their life, while each one goes about his own business in respect of everything else. And of course, that's perfectly true. This is why not all minorities, but certain minorities, most notably the Jews, but ethnic Chinese in Asia outside of China, Lebanese in places like West Africa, why they have prospered. People don't like them, but it doesn't matter because they can supply some good or service a little cheaper or a little better than the person next to them, or some optimal combination of those two things. Right? And so people will trade with them anyway. Prices not only transmit information from the ultimate buyers to retailers, manufacturers, they also transmit information the other way. Suppose that a forest fire or strike reduces the availability of wood. The price of wood will go up. That will tell the manufacturer of pencils that it'll pay him to use less wood, and it will not pay him to produce as many pencils as before unless he can sell them for a higher price because he's having to pay more for his wood. Right? And the higher price will inform the final user that it will pay him to wear his pencil down to a shorter stub or shift to a mechanical pencil. He doesn't need to know why the pencil has become expensive, only that it has. By the way, concerning that last sentence, I'd point out that this goes some way, at least, to account for why rich Western consumers are so dumb. They don't need to know anything about the world. They just need to know the current price being demanded of them.
Right. Yeah. That's not untrue, I think.
Yes.
So, do you find his argument persuasive overall?
Yes, I do. Up until this point, I'd still been clinging to various shreds of either socialist or more quasi-socialist ideas about the economy. And reading this book, it was one of those moments when I realized here was an argument to which there was no possible answer. It was a bit like reading Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Okay, that's it. If you have this postulate inside your head, will it enable you to predict what happens next? Answer, yes. Therefore, postulate, good. Right? That.
Right.
I mean, I have retreated from that quite considerably in recent years, but not for any quasi-socialist reasons, but on other grounds. But we'll come to that in a moment. Okay, here is Sir Keith Joseph, who was, again, thinking along similar lines and was a mentor to Margaret Thatcher, who would go on to become British Prime Minister. Here she is, elected first in May 1979, and she upended British politics, reversed the country's economic decline, broke the power of the blue-collar unions, but not of the white-collar unions. I want to pat myself on the back for my own prescience by the late 1980s. Yes, she had broken the power of the mining unions and the steel workers and people like this, but it was the white-collar unions of the teachers, the nurses, and the doctors that would finally do her and her project down. And so it has proved. But anyway, she denationalized state-owned industries, many of which had been nationalized in the post-1945 Labour government, and she revived support for free markets. And of course, how could we not mention her American alter ego, Ronald Reagan, president from 1981 to 89, and he similarly sought to pare back the state and finally defeat communism. He mostly succeeded in the latter. It's far from clear whether he really succeeded in the former. But again, this was his aspiration.
So, it sounds like this is all well and good, and this was probably a good thing for the economy, but the rest of us are still waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right, here comes the other shoe. Well, could you stand 4 shoes? Number 1,
Oh,
this is just another ideology. And so in Cold War context, it might count as right-wing, but not as conservative, because conservatism is actually opposition to ideologies. In any case, free markets, if you remember, counted as liberal and left in the 19th century. Secondly,
right.
there are a whole host of things where free market dogmas cannot hold. Sex, drugs, weapons, but also things like natural monopolies. There's only one water pipe coming to your house, only one sewage tunnel, only one electricity cable, only one gas pipe. It's a nonsense to say, well, there's 10 different gas companies. Which one do I want powering my oven today? Who has the best price? It's a natural monopoly. Something similar is true of a railway track, by the way. And so there, governments have a choice between state ownership or private ownership that is strongly state controlled so that the consumer is not ripped off. And there is no right answer to that, by the way. Which is better will vary from one country to another, often determined by things like geography or size of population or how thinly the population is spread over an area and that kind of thing, as well as political culture. But also mere self-interest exists in not allowing the poor to become too desperate. Even if you don't care about the poor at all or have no conscience, you still need to make sure that they don't become too poor and too desperate, because you will suffer from the resultant crime and social instability, or perhaps support for a revolution. Right? All of these things need to be taken account of. And we haven't even brought morality into it here, but morality is very important too. Thirdly, unrestrained market forces heighten individualism. They atomize society, which is hardly conservative. They also reduce cultural heritage to what someone is prepared to pay for, right? Because everything is simply made a commodity in a free market. And they also undermine traditional, especially rural communities and minority languages and cultures, and even families, actually, which is why so many Westerners live hundreds of miles from their parents or children or siblings as they go to follow a job, right? People move around in search of work. Well, this is not very conservative. So, for all of these reasons, neoconservatism is not conservative at all. It dissolves the social glue. It's conservative, in quotation marks, only relative to socialist statism. But it's one more reductionist ideology, what C.S. Lewis would have called nothing buttery. So it's not that the insights of someone like Friedman or Hayek or von Mises are without merit. They certainly have a lot of merit. But it's the kind of analysis that says that you are finally 9 parts water. Well, yeah, but it certainly needs to be taken account of, and it's certainly an improvement on socialism. But don't pretend that it's anything other than an ideology, and it's certainly not conservatism.
Well, what are you going to say to that?
Okay, well, moving on, Western societies, as we all know, everybody watching this knows, have been experiencing a deep malaise in recent decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Reagan Thatcher era now seems like a long time ago. The left has continued moving further along its 1970s trajectory, but the right no longer looks like this at all either.
No, it doesn't. It's been transformed, and largely as a result of the malaise. Well, let's look at the contrast between electoral promises made by both right wing and left wing parties and the poisonous realities.
It sounds like we better prepare ourselves for some more Pierce-ish poison.
Yeah, but delivered with admirable even handedness. I'm sure you'll agree. Okay, here's my take. Since 1945, Western parties of the centre right have mostly promised to cut taxes and put more of voters' hard earned money back in their pockets. But they have not dared to cut back social spending to match the tax cuts. Western parties of the centre left have mostly promised to increase social benefits and social spending, things like health, education, and so on, one sort or another. But they have not dared to increase taxes sufficiently to pay for them, because they've both got an eye to the next election. And so both have bridged the gap between promise and reality by increased public borrowing, such that Westerners are living by accruing a vast burden of debt, which their children will be required to carry. Now, let's consider some of the key problems facing all Western countries at the moment. Demographic decline has led to spiraling government debt because we've got a smaller tax base relative to the liabilities of government for things like pensions, health, education, infrastructure, and so on, cramping government's ability to pay for these things because they need to service the debt apart from anything else, and cramping their ability to renew our infrastructure, which is getting crumblier and crumblier. And we have a sluggish economy because of our demography. I mean, the first country to experience this was Japan in the 1990s, and they have tried absolutely every darn thing since, and they can't stop it because their society is aging with the kind of consequences we just mentioned. And that brings about a need for, but a resentment of, mass immigration. So immigration is now an incredibly hot button issue because there's a need for these people to fill out the workforce because it's shrinking relative to the number of old people. So that's then creating its own backlash. By the way, I would point out that all of these things are downstream from our demography, and our demography is downstream from the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So, the digital revolution has made countless valuable skills redundant, leading to greatly increased wealth disparities and greatly diminished prospects for a large slice of the population, particularly the younger generations, who cannot really, for the most part, hope to have the same levels of prosperity that their parents' generation did. Globalization has led to offshoring of remaining manufacturing. And finally, there's the kind of global situation. The West no longer dominates the world economically, militarily, or politically to anything like the degree that it did in the 1990s. Just to take one important example of that, about 20 years ago, some commentators pointed out that the US military was so much bigger than everybody else's that it could fight 4 or 5 wars simultaneously around the world and win them all. Whereas the situation now is totally different, and senior American defense officials have wargamed a potential conflict with China in the South China Sea, and in all of those gamed events, America loses virtually every time. That's just the most graphic example.
Right. Well, so other than making everybody depressed, what you're saying is that these intractable problems are really what account for our dismal politics right now.
Basically, yes. Where problems are intractable, the political initiative passes to those who will focus on blame rather than solutions.
Right, like what we saw in the 1930s.
Yeah, which is very worrying. It leads to deepening social division, the prominence of purveyors of illusory non-solutions, and conspiracy theories and populists. And of course, that is exactly what we are seeing right now, especially on the right, obviously, but also we've seen some of it lately on the left.
Right.
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Let's just have a look at one other thing that is also making government more and more ineffectual and would do even in fairly benign circumstances. Vlad Vexler is a political theorist and commentator, produces loads of videos on YouTube, usually well worth watching. He says this is a paradox of modern democracy, that in 2025, our democracies, which are in decline, need bold action to survive, but are designed to smother bold action, if not make it entirely impossible. The ill-sorted mess of checks and balances in our democracies actually largely prevents the bold action that we need for democratic survival.
Now, this is interesting, but it's also confusing because, I've always thought that checks and balances are a good thing.
Well, they are a good thing, but the elementary constitutional checks and balances have been overgrown by a jungle of vested interests that strangle necessary action. I mean, this is why voters are getting so frustrated and reaching out to radicals and populists. Certainly, a lot of voters in Britain will say it doesn't matter who we elect. our problems don't get addressed. And to be entirely fair to the politicians, that is true because their actions are constantly constrained by NGOs and international organizations and the special powers of various bodies within the state that make it impossible to follow through on anything even remotely resembling a radical action. The plethora of checks and balances, counter-majoritarian institutions, supranational organizations, NGOs, to say nothing of corporate influence buying, which is vast and extremely damaging, have made elected governments almost powerless to take action. And so voting seems pointless, ordinary people feel disempowered, and that is the populists' opportunity. But populism leads to the demise of democracy. Hence the paradox. Okay, well, reinvention number 2 on the right, vengeful populism.
So we're suggesting that this second reinvention of the right since 1945 is a response to all of the calamities that we've just been looking at.
Mostly that, yes. Its claimed reaction to the excesses of woke is certainly part of it, but in practice, it's less important than the other stuff. The populist right hasn't the least desire to undo the sexual revolution and its disastrous consequences. It's every bit as post-truth and morally relativist as it accuses the left of being. Indeed, it fights shy of even the tiniest hint of introspection. It's playing the blame game.
Of course.
Well, let's look at some of our cast of villains, if you like. So we've got Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary since 2010, and he has been slowly strangling a whole load of democratic mechanisms in Hungary. It still seems likely, actually, that he might be voted out of office next year by a new vigorous challenger. But we're all holding our breath now to see if he's going to find a way of creating an emergency that will give him the excuse he might want to cancel the elections. So there's him. There is, of course, Donald Trump, right? US president 2017 to 21, and from 2025 to, well, who knows? He's already talking about the possibility of a third term, which would be unconstitutional. But with so many lapdogs around him, who knows if the Constitution will be amended or suspended to gratify him. In Germany, we have Alice Weidel, leader of the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and her party leads opinion polls. Perhaps fortunately, we've only fairly recently had a general election there, so one isn't due for a few years, and a lot can happen in that time. But right now, she's in the lead. And then, of course, we've got Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, which leads both Labour and Conservative in opinion polls by a very long way. And if it can maintain support, that's a big if, it will win the next general election, which isn't due until 2029. So similar to the German situation, we're a little way out from that.
Okay, I think we've had enough of the monsters already. I mean, you'll be scaring the little children before bedtime.
Yes, this is true. Okay, well, what do the leaders of the new right have in common? Firstly, populism, a claim to speak for the common person who is being cheated by an alliance of elites with an outgroup.
So there's an inevitable element of conspiracy discourse here.
Yes, there is. That naturally is part of that whole way of talking, and that's been part of the populists' stock in trade for well over a century. Yes. Protectionism and opposition to transnational organizations. So we're turning neoconservatism on its head here. Demanding sweeping cuts in immigration and often mass repatriation, which will certainly have very interesting consequences for the labour market and thus for the economy. A claimed defence of national culture and opposition to multiculturalism, but especially opposition to Islam. And obviously, lots of people are made very uneasy by rapid cultural change. Right. So there is an element of genuine conservatism there, albeit very aggressively expressed, and an unwillingness to support Ukraine, lukewarmness about NATO, and friendship with, or at least refusal to oppose, Putin in current geopolitics.
So it sounds like you'd maintain that this is even less conservative than neoconservatism was.
Yes, conservatism means, inter alia, fostering social cohesion, tolerance, old style meaning. I feel I need to explain this. Tolerance meant I'm right, you're wrong, but I'm not going to mistreat you on account of it, right? Whereas it's
Right.
come in recent decades to mean how can anyone possibly know what is true or right? And if you insist that you do know, you are intolerant. Wrong. Anyway, so actual conservatism means tolerance, old style, right? Continuity with the past, the kind of thing that Russell Kirk was talking about. Yes, you make changes, but they continue from existing institutions and ways of doing things. Minimal tampering with institutions. The only conservative element about the new right is a claimed assertion of loyalty to tradition. But tradition waved as a banner or a battle flag is no more traditional than religion waved as a battle flag is consistent with actual Christian faith. It's done merely to emphasize division, us versus them, which is in itself destructive of stability, and stability is the centerpiece of actual conservatism.
Right. Right.
Well, having mentioned all of these people on the latest incarnation of the right, we should mention, I suppose, this guy as well, Zoran Mamdani, mayor of New York.
Oof. Now, this guy is definitely a populist, but he's on the far left. Does he have a future?
Well, in New York City, probably, because New York City is a very particular kind of place. But he will
Yeah.
damage the city as a financial center unless he backtracks on his promises.
Mm.
On the one hand, his democratic socialism is too piecemeal to be actually socialist. On the other hand, his projects won't work. City, city run grocery stores, the very idea falls to bits as soon as you work through how that would work.
Right.
His election is a function of New Yorkers' anger at Trump, just as Trump's election was a function of inchoate anger across the country, not
Mm.
necessarily at Biden, but at the ways in which society and government and the economy were malfunctioning.
Right. Right. So we're at an impasse.
We're not so much at a dangerous moment as in a dangerous period. Right? This isn't going to stop. This is going to be chronic over a while. If our problems have solutions at all, and perhaps they don't, they are long term. And least of all will they be remedied by iconoclastic, tear it all down demagogues who imply they have a magic wand.
Right. I suspect this is what most of our viewers knew in their heart of hearts anyway.
Yes, yes, I think they did.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation and perhaps, at least hopefully, a little bit eye opening. On that note, in our next series, we're going to be turning to perhaps a more edifying topic, the Great Awakening and its aftermath. So we'll be starting with the careers of John and Charles Wesley and their unique contributions to religious life.
Yes, yes. So we're going to be looking at them, some of the other people operating around the same time, and take the story on into the early 19th century. Yes.
Well, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Enjoyed maybe not be the right word, but hopefully you got something out of it. And we would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to our content, share it on social media, annoy everybody with our thoughts and opinions so that everybody can be equally depressed. It's good. It's good to be a realist, right?
Absolutely. Spread the misery and the love around, everybody. Thank you for staying with us, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.